At the beginning of the 20th century, we're going to see things are going to improve for the average American. During the Gilded Age, industrial workers had seen their working hours go up while their wages had gone down. Farmers had gone increasingly into debt, and more farmers had become tenant farmers or sharecroppers. Politicians in general had ignored the plight of industrial workers and farmers. As we talked about, the Republican Party, they didn't mind intervening in the economy, but generally they did it for the purpose of helping business, and particularly big business. And as we mentioned, Democrats were initially laissez-faire, although following 1896, they're going to start getting involved in the economy, but particularly concerning economic matters. Again, Democratic Party, their base is in the South. They don't want their party interfering in social issues and what changes that might bring us in regards to civil rights. But as we mentioned, 1896, Democrats do start talking about using political power to help the average guy. But as we mentioned, they're going to lose the 1896 election. Well, what we're going to see in 1901 to 1914 is the poor conditions for the average American will start to improve. Now, this isn't going to be a rapid improvement, but we'll see in general, Americans are going to see higher wages, better quality of life, working hours decrease, wages go up, and there's going to be a couple different reasons for this. Why is life going to start to get better for Americans at the turn of the 20th century? Well, there's a lot of smaller reasons. This isn't something that can simply be broken down into one reason or another, but some of the smaller reasons are that we see that some of the problems of industrial Gilded Age United States are going to start to be addressed by technology. Now, we didn't get to talk about a lot of technology, but we did mention electricity will start to be developed, telephones, that type of thing. In some ways, this technology is actually going to make things worse. Electricity means you can have greater working hours now that you can work when the sun's going down. But in other ways, it will improve Americans' lives. If you can go home from work, even though the sun's go down, and you can still enjoy your time with the family because electricity is starting to spread across the country, that's going to be a benefit to the average American. And this technology in the early 20th century become more and more affordable as mass production starts to increase, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Cost of living in some regards will go down. Transportation improvements, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's going to become easier to get from one place to another for Americans. So technology, that's going to be a part of this improvement in lifestyle. Another thing we're going to see is you have to give Gilded Age politicians some credit, because we will see that American business is going to start rivaling British business across the world, and in some ways exceeding it. And as we'll see very shortly, U.S. industry will outpace Britain. And some of the benefits are going to start trickle down to the average worker. Now, as we're going to talk about, there's going to be a reason we'll see some of this trickling down, but U.S. products will be starting to be sold internationally in greater and greater numbers. And this wealth will go to the United States. Again, it's going to start out funnily into the hands of a few, but the additional wealth, some of it is going to make its way to the bottom. Again, this is a smaller reason. Another thing you sort of have to give the late 1800s politicians credit for, again, you can also criticize them for this, is this imperialism. So again, while the United States is stepping in, carving out political control, or political influence and economic influence throughout the world, whether it be boots on the ground, as in the case of the Philippines, or diplomacy in the case of China, or sort of these subversive neocolonialist methods in Latin America. What has been happening is the U.S. has been gaining greater market share in the international economy in places that maybe U.S. products weren't sold, or they were sold with a high tariff or something like that, or could not be sold. Now these markets are going to be open to U.S. goods. This is going to increase production in the United States, which is going to see, once that happens, this will eventually make its way down to the employees. Greater production, greater market sales will help employers, and eventually it'll help employees. Also, cheaper goods are going to be coming to the United States. And just as a small example, if you are able to produce bananas really cheaply in Honduras or Guatemala, you can send this stuff to the United States, and somebody who maybe couldn't have afforded these products before U.S. starts getting this control in these areas, bananas become cheaper. whatever product becomes cheaper, it's going to hit the market. And average worker, even though they're not making much money, might be able to afford these things. So this is just some examples of some small things that are going to be sitting in the background and improving Americans' lives. But if it was just these things alone, I still think the average American would probably be living in squalor, and we wouldn't see a whole heck of a lot of improvement in people's lives in the earliest 20th century. But one way that we will see improvement is beginning at the start of the 20th century, we're going to see more and more American politicians describe themselves as progressives. And they're going to start coming to believe that it is to the benefit of the average American, and it is their job to improve the lives of the average American, okay? We're going to see more and more politicians, and this is going to be at the local level, so a city government, the state level, and at the national level, we'll start seeing the purpose of the government is to improve society and improve the lives of their constituents and the average American. We'll see Democrats, and we already talked about this briefly, abandon their laissez-faire philosophy in favor of increased government intervention in the economy. And as we're about to talk about, Republicans are going to briefly step away from their pro-business philosophy and adopt this philosophy where it's the government's job to help the average American. I believe that, and I think a lot of historians believe that this progressive politics is going to be responsible for improving people's lives. We'll see governments, instead of ignoring unions or even pushing back and fighting unions, will start to work closer with unions. And this is going to allow unions to make gains where they previously wouldn't have in the Gilded Age. And so we're going to see this new definition of the government in people's lives. The government will start taking on an increased role in people's lives. Again, before this, a lot of politicians thought it's there for defensive purposes. Republicans help the economy. A lot of people didn't see it as the government's responsibility to help the average American. That's going to start to change, all right? All right, so we're going to see these progressive politicians emerge. Before we start talking specific progressive politicians, please be aware that progressive politicians aren't going to belong to one party, okay? Democrats are going to be progressives. Republicans are going to be progressives. Third-party candidates are going to be progressives. It's just this general idea that will be adopted by a variety of different politicians that it's the government's responsibility to help the average American. So why are we going to see this switch? I mean, we already talked a little bit about it when we talked about the Democrats, but why all of a sudden will the general political atmosphere turn from ignoring the little guy in the Gilded Age to caring for the little guy? Well, I believe that it's going to happen as a result of one person getting in power. Again, a lot of people can argue with me, and as we're about to talk about, this isn't just happening at the national level, it's happening at the state and city level, county level as well. But I think that the thing that's really going to kick off this progressive era is we are going to get a politician entering the presidency that's going to set the tone for other politicians. So we talked about last time, in 1901, President McKinley, generally pro-business Republican, is going to be assassinated by this Leon Czolgosz guy. Once he dies, he's going to be replaced by this dude. All right, this guy's name is Theodore Roosevelt. We talked about him a little bit before, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be different than any politician during the Gilded Age. He's going to be this guy that sees it as his personal responsibility to help the average American. Now, I don't like hero worship, but I really think this guy's incredibly unique, and I think he alone is going to start driving this politics. Now, during the 20th century, and really after 1865 or so, you don't see a lot of politicians that will have the power to sort of shape the narrative of the nation. You see that a little bit more late 1700s, George Washington, Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s. You don't see it much post-Civil War, but I think we're going to see that here with Teddy Roosevelt. I think, again, not him alone, and what we're going to be talking about is not exclusively Teddy Roosevelt, but we are going to be talking through Teddy Roosevelt because I think this guy alone is going to sort of grab the American consciousness, and he's going to change the narrative of U.S. politics, and he's going to end up changing his own political party. He's going to end up working with the other political party, and we're going to see things happen that I don't think would have happened if he hadn't become president. I think if McKinley had survived, things may have stayed the same. I don't think politicians like Teddy Roosevelt would have gotten elected if McKinley hadn't been assassinated. I think this weird circumstance that's going to occur is going to lead to dramatic change in the United States. So who is Teddy Roosevelt, and why is he going to be changing the government? All right. Okay. Well, Teddy Roosevelt, things you need to know about him is that he was a fairly wealthy person. He was born to a wealthy New York family who had made money through capitalism, merchants, in entrepreneurial ventures. They were wealthy. He was much richer than the average American. He grew up in a wealthy house in New York, and as a young child, he received education, tutors that the average American probably wouldn't have had access to simply because they didn't have the money. So, very wealthy person. He's not going to be one of these made from nothing or came up from nothing type of people. Very wealthy person. Well, the thing about Teddy is he's going to learn that while wealth and while capitalism is good, his father's going to sort of try to imbue in him that there are rules to it. You know, you're supposed to be fair in capitalism. You're not supposed to rip the other guy off, things like that. Teddy's upbringing is also, he's going to recognize that he has advantages, and what he's going to come to learn is that he would like to see other Americans with these type of advantages. So, born into wealth, but a responsible capitalist and somebody who thinks that other Americans should have the advantages that he has. Another thing about Teddy Roosevelt is that he's going to have a dramatic experience early in his life. All right, so he was born to a father from New York, wealthy family in New York. His mother was wealthy Southerner. His mother was actually a Democrat. His father's a Republican. But the thing that's going to shape Teddy's politics and get him to join one political party is the fact that as a child, he's going to see Abraham Lincoln's funeral, and it's going to affect him. As a child, Teddy Roosevelt remembers looking out his window as Abraham Lincoln's funeral passed through New York. So basically, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, they brought his body throughout the North, eventually making its way to Illinois, where Lincoln is going to be buried. Well, Teddy remembers this being an important part of his life, and it's interesting because in his memoirs, he writes down that he and his brother watched as Lincoln's funeral procession passed by his childhood home. Now, this is kind of interesting because this photo right here is a photo of Lincoln's funeral from as it went through New York. We don't have very many photos of Lincoln's funeral simply because there weren't very many cameras in the United States during Lincoln's funeral, and not that many took pictures of the funeral, and many of the photos were lost. This is one that survived. The interesting thing that makes this photo cool is that somebody looking at this photo had just read Teddy Roosevelt's memoir, and they started noticing, wait a minute, this right here is the Roosevelt home. Teddy said that he and his little brother watched the funeral out of their window. Who the heck is this? This is actually Teddy Roosevelt and his little brother. We actually have a future president in a picture of Lincoln's funeral. I mean, the chances of this happening are crazy. I don't know the exact number, but I guess we have probably 6 pictures of photographs of Lincoln's funeral, and one happens to contain a future president as a child. Anyway, so he's going to become a Republican in part because of his experience here, and he's going to notice the Republicans during Reconstruction, a time when they see it as their responsibility to reform to make things better. Now, we talked about post-Reconstruction, Republicans had become pro-business Republicans, but during Reconstruction, they were trying to improve lives for African Americans and, in general, make things more equal in the United States. Now, eventually, you're going to sort of get away from that, but during Teddy Roosevelt's formative years, that was their goal. And so, Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to become a Republican, but he's going to become this reform-minded Republican. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt, he's also a pretty big Christian in the way he sees, as a Christian, you're supposed to help the other guy, and this is going to affect his personality. So, young man born into wealth, Republican from a young age, progressive Republican. Um, Other experiences he's going to have as a child. Teddy was born with poor eyesight. He's going to wear glasses throughout his life. And as a young kid, he's going to be pretty unhealthy. He has asthma. He fairly weak. As a young kid, he gets beat up by a lot of these bullies in his neighborhood. Well, he would talk to his father, complain about, the situation, and his father would say, "You got to get tough. I'm not going to go there to take care of you. You have to take care of yourself." So he's going to tell Teddy, you've got to improve physically. You have to be physically tough. You can't get beat up by these bullies. And instead of letting Teddy cry or whatever because he's getting beat up, his father's going to take him out horseback riding, take him out into the countryside, and tell him, hey, you've got to work hard and improve yourself physically. Teddy will start, becoming physically tough. He's going to enjoy the outdoors, go hunting with his father a lot, start participating in sports. This is a picture of him from a rowing team. He joins rowing, becomes pretty in shape. Not only that, he's going to become pretty big in boxing. He really enjoys boxing until he's in a sparring match and gets one of his eyes sort of knocked out of socket, and knocked out of socket might be the right word, but just offset a little bit, and it's going to exacerbate the problems he has with his vision. After that, he'll take up judo and jiu-jitsu. So he actually gets to, I believe, brown belt level in jiu-jitsu, also does wrestling. So we have a president that's going to do boxing, wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu. Essentially, he's going to be an MMA fighter. If you were to throw all the presidents in a cage fighting match, I'm pretty sure Teddy, maybe Gerald Ford, are going to emerge at the top of this thing simply because of his experience in martial arts. Now, he wasn't the best athlete, but he is going to work hard in martial arts, and I think that would put him the edge in our presidential cage fighting tournament. So physically tough, not just physically tough, mentally tough. One of the things his father would push in him is you've got to be smart. You can't just rely on physical toughness. You got to be smarter than the other guy. And he's going to hire tutors for Teddy. Eventually, when he gets to the age, Teddy will go to school at Harvard, best school in the country, earn an education there. He's going to graduate from there. And after he graduates, he's going to continue his education by being a prolific reader and writer. As a matter of fact, early in adulthood, he's going to start writing on a variety of different subjects. He actually goes out west. He gets married at a fairly young age, but his wife dies. He gets kind of depressed about it. He goes west, works on this Montana ranch, writes about his experiences in a book. He's going to write on naval theories. This is one of the reasons McKinley will later hire him as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, because he comes up with these ideas from history. If we have powerful Navy, this is going to allow us to have a lot of influence around the world. So, prolific writer, very well educated. Another thing about Teddy is, as growing up and being bullied and, sort of working his way up to become tough, Teddy develops this hatred of bullies. He doesn't like people that pick on the weak. So you can see Teddy, during his career, he's going to be somebody who bullies bullies. He doesn't mind picking on somebody if they're picking on somebody else, but he doesn't like those who pick on the weak. And this is going to be very evident in Teddy's first political position. By the way, you can kind of think of Teddy as almost like a dad figure, because what we're going to see in his political career is he's going to try to take care of people even if they don't want to be taken care of. So you can almost think of him as like dad. You like dad when he steps up to defend you, although he can somewhat be domineering at other times. So one way we're going to see Teddy bully bullies is that early in his life, he's going to run for New York Police Commissioner. What that means is he's going to be the guy in charge of police in New York. And one of the things he's going to put in place, or at least try to put in place, is a policy where if somebody is caught beating their wife, a man's caught beating his wife, you can whip that person. So bully, we're going to bully the bullies. Now, this policy, you can absolutely question whether physical violence is a response to somebody who's committing physical violence. I don't know if that's the right answer, but Teddy's going to think it is because, again, he has this bullier of bully mindset, okay? And we're going to see this later when he becomes president, and we're going to see this when he starts criticizing, even before he becomes president, some of these financial fat cats, the robber barons. Basically, he sees these people that are running out of business, small businesses, taking advantage of workers. He sees them as financial bullies. So, in this regard, this is going to be Teddy. He's a bullier of bullies, and he sees the robber barons and these monopolists as bullies. Teddy, one of the things we're going to see him highly criticized for is that as a bullier of bullies, he's going to think it's his responsibility, and this is going to be demonstrated when he becomes president, to show other countries how things are done. One of his big philosophies is going to be we're going to sort of elbow our way in and get dictators to treat their people right, or at least as the United States would think they treat them right. And we're going to see Teddy have no issue with using American power to intervene in foreign affairs, particularly Latin American affairs. We talked last time about how the U.S. takes over Panama to create the canal. That's actually, it starts under McKinley, but Teddy's going to be the one that authorizes the push for Panamanian independence, and he's going to be the one that stops Colombian troops from putting down the Panamanian independence movement. He basically says, I took Panama. So this bullier of bully philosophy, it will apply to his treatment of major capitalists. It's also going to apply to his position in the world. He wants the United States to be powerful militarily and intervene whenever he sees something as wrong. Again, we're going to talk about a lot of people criticizing him because did these other countries ask for your help? But that's certainly going to be a major criticism of him. So a bullier of bullies for good, bad, however that's going to be. All right, so Teddy is going to, here's him, one of his major issues when he becomes president is to create a large navy and so show American military might throughout the world. All right, so that's Teddy Roosevelt, dad, bullier of bullies, progressive politician who thinks it's the government responsibility to get rid of bullies at home and abroad and to take care of the little guy. Paternalistic. One of the criticisms, besides the imperialist policies you get with Teddy, is that some people think, hey, we don't necessarily ask for help. You know, maybe he's going to expand the government too far. Again, that you got to take the good with bad because, as we're going to see, a lot of positive changes will happen with Americans. But a lot of times, Teddy, people criticize him, you know, for I'm going to take care of you whether you want to be taken care of or not. All right, so Teddy will get into power following McKinley's assassination, and almost immediately we'll see the direction of the country change. Now, what we're going to focus on in this lecture is how Teddy is going to implement these progressive politics at the national level. There are also progressives operating at the state level. Like we'll see at state level, some states will start to pass minimum wages, start to pass labor laws, child labor laws, that type of thing. That happens at the state level. We'll also see at the state level things like prohibition laws preventing the sale of alcohol. And again, that's sort of this progressive politics. We're taking care of society by removing some of the ills from society. We're not going to talk much about the state and local level. We're going to talk about the national level, how the national government's going to change, and how Teddy's going to direct that. But please know that it's also happening at the local level as well. So what do we mean by changing things? And how is this new guy going to be different than the people that came before him? How's he going to be different than McKinley? And one thing I should probably mention, the only reason Teddy is on McKinley's ticket in 1900, he wasn't originally running with McKinley in 1896, is because the Republican Party wanted to shut him up. He's criticizing the Republican Party for not doing enough for reform. He's incredibly popular for his military efforts before and during the Spanish-American War, and they didn't like that this guy had a voice, this young kid. And Teddy, when he takes office, He's going to be something like, I think, 39 years old, so incredibly young to be serving in this position. They stuck him as VP because they didn't think he would be able to criticize McKinley as VP. He did sometimes, by the way, but now the Republicans are going to be upset because in 1901, now they're going to have to deal with this loud, abrasive, very different guy taking power. So how's he going to be different? All right. Teddy, we're going to give a couple examples of how national politics will change under him and how he's going to deal with things differently than his predecessors. One thing we'll see with Teddy is that he's going to start reaching out to workers more than previous presidents had and working to help industrial workers and farmers using the power of the national government. Again, we can't give all the different examples. We'll just go ahead and give one. In 1902, there is going to be a major strike in this area of eastern Pennsylvania. Let's see, get to a good picture of the United States, hopefully. All right, I can't get to it, but anyway, in western Pennsylvania, there's a strike by these anthracite coal mine workers, and throughout this region of western Pennsylvania, these guys that would go down, get the coal, are going to determine we want a decrease in working hours. At this point, they work 10 hours a day. They want to work 8 hours a day, and they want a 20% increase in pay. Well, the mine is controlled by, or the various anthracite coal mines in the region are controlled by these, what you would call robber barons, these sort of wealthy capitalists that have been controlling the coal mining industry for a long time. Well, when these workers, they're going to organize, they're going to go on strike in 1902 and basically say, we're not going to go back to work until we get this 20% pay increase, a 2-hour reduction in workday. So the mines get shut down. Well, this is going to be a problem because without coal, people's homes aren't going to be heated. Now, today we have all sorts of different types of electricity. We have electric heaters, things like that. But back then, most homes still don't have electricity, although they'll have them soon. The way that they heated their homes was through coal. You would put coal in the heater, and that would heat up the home. Without the coal, homes aren't going to get heated in the winter of 1902, 1903. You're simply not going to have enough to heat the homes. Well, this means, today we have better insulation, that type of thing. Maybe this wouldn't be a huge issue, but back in 1902, people, they don't have coal, they don't have heat. You're going to see a lot of people die. The old people, young people, they need this heat to survive. They're not going to get it if the coal mines shut down. Well, if it was a previous president, president before Teddy, they might, stay out of this, whatever. We'll let the situation work itself out. Or they might send in, the militia or somehow support the coal mine owners by, breaking up the strikers, saying it's a public disturbance, public nuisance or whatever, break up the coal mine workers, and then allow replacement workers to get into the mines. Mines open up again, and then you get the coal producing. Teddy doesn't want to do that, okay? He thinks the coal miners have an argument. He thinks that, they deserve additional pay, decrease in working hours. So he doesn't want to do that. So what Teddy is going to decide to do is he will write the coal mine owners, and he's going to tell them, I've got an idea, you guys. Will you sit down with the coal mine workers, and I'd like you to sit down with the coal mine workers and try to figure something out here. I want you to sit down with them, have a discussion. We need these coal mines open because people need to have their homes heated. Well, he's going to send these letters to the coal mine owners. The coal mine owners will say, no, Mr. President, we're not going to do that because we don't want to recognize the unions. We don't want to negotiate with the unions. So if we sit down with them, that'd be recognizing them, and we don't want to do that. Well, and essentially they'll add on to their letter back to Teddy. Now, why don't you be a dear and send out the militia or something, and break up these strikes for us. That's what previous presidents would do. They sort of act like Teddy Roosevelt is working for them, not the other way around. Well, Teddy will respond to this by saying, all right, I've got two proposals for you. I am going to form a commission. What this commission will do is up to you. He will say, one, this commission, and it's going to be made up of guys that Teddy Roosevelt trusts, these arbitrators. He's going to say, I'm going to send them to the mine, and they can meet with you. They can meet the coal mine workers, their union, and they can settle, come up with a solution, come up with a fair compromise between you two, and both of you have to accept the compromise. That's option one. So you can sit down with the coal mine workers. My arbitrators will listen to both you guys, come up with a compromise. You have to accept the compromise. Or two, I'm going to send this commission to take over the mines for you. I'm going to essentially nationalize the mines, claim this is a national emergency, which it would be, nationalize them, take over the mines, pay the workers what they need to, and then we're going to get that coal out of the mines. We're going to take this thing over, and you guys are not going to have any say in it. So you can either work with the arbitrators, or you can refuse to work with them, and I'm just going to take your property, and I'm going to get the workers back to work. Well, the coal mine owners, given this choice, are going to say, we would absolutely like option number one. We're going to sit down with your arbitrators. This is a cartoon from the Times saying what didn't happen in the coal controversy. They didn't sit down with the coal mine owners or workers. Now they're going to. And the arbitrators are going to come in. They're going to listen to both sides, and they're going to come up with a compromise where we're going to give a 10% increase in pay, reduce work hours by 1 hour. So you don't get 8-hour work days, you get 9 hours. You don't get 20% pay increase, you get 10% pay increase. Absolutely fair. And just to show how fair it was, both the workers and the owners are going to get up from the table furious. That's when you know you've got a good compromise, when both sides leave unhappy. So Teddy basically didn't back down to these robber barons as previous presidents may have done. This is a cartoon from the time. Here's Teddy Roosevelt looking at these major coal mine owners and basically saying, using federal authority to tell them this is what needs to be done. Primary classroom for coal barons, fate of people who thought they owned the earth. So these guys thought they owned the earth. They thought they could boss Teddy around, but instead he settled this in a fashion that didn't just give to the workers. It wasn't anything like that. It just forced both these guys to compromise. Very different than previous presidents. Any pro-business aspect, you don't see that here. I mean, you don't see anti-business here. You just see him settling things in a fair manner. This isn't the only way that Teddy's going to encourage cooperation between laborers and owners. In 1903, Teddy's going to form a new department of the presidency, a new cabinet. So the president had Department of the Interior, Department of War, Department of Treasury. He's going to create the Department of Commerce and Labor. But the whole purpose of it is basically to get commercial interest, commerce, and labor to work together. It's a government organization, a cabinet, that's going to advise the president on issues that commerce and labor are facing, so the government can step in and arbitrate a fair settlement between these various groups. So he's going to actually work with the unions instead of breaking apart unions as previous presidents would have done. He's going to do other things, like he's not going to dictate, at least not at this point, he's not going to push for Social Security insurance just yet, but he will make it, if you're a federal employee and you get injured on the job, you get liability. You're going to get pay for if you lose an arm or something like that. That's pretty interesting. So government employees at least will get liability insurance. So working with labor, very different than previous presidents before him. Another way Teddy's going to be different is that he's going to start taking on these monopolists. So as we mentioned, there had been guys like John D. Rockefeller, a couple of these guys throughout the United States who had used the fact that they had more capital and had sort of gotten out of front of everybody else to create monopolies. John D. Rockefeller would, go into an area, try to buy out a business. If they won't sell to him, he'd drive that company out of business and then take over the market share, and essentially got to the point where his expendable capital, his market share, prevented anybody from fairly competing with him, and he had used his extra money to or he had basically driven up prices, price gouged, and then he'd use the money he was bringing in to pay off politicians, things like that, to make sure that no regulation would come between them. When states tried to clamp down on it with things like you could only own a certain percentage of a company if you own a company in another state, John D. Rockefeller had gotten around it by forming these trusts, essentially independent companies, but in reality they worked for John D. Rockefeller and they drove competition out of business. Well, we had talked about that in 1890 the United States had passed that Sherman Antitrust Act to determine if a monopoly was being operated. If it was, the federal government could step in, force the companies to compete with one another, for stock sell-offs, that type of thing. The problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act was proving that a monopoly was occurring. That requires a lot of paperwork. You've got to get, witnesses. You have to get check logs for sales, that type of thing. That requires a lot of legwork. There was no provisions in the Sherman Antitrust creating this investigatory body. Well, in 1903, Teddy will push for a department to be created within the Department of Commerce and Labor called the Bureau of Corporations. What the Bureau of Corporations will be is an investigatory body, okay? The Bureau of Corporations will go and it will look at companies like Standard Oil, although they're not immediately going to investigate Standard Oil. That's going to take a little while. But they would go and try to round up witnesses, try to look at a company's books, and if they determine it was a monopoly, then they're going to start forcing these stock sell-offs and then use government power to basically they're going to try the company on anti-competitive practices, try them on the Sherman Antitrust Act for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, and if they found they violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, they're going to be broken up into smaller companies. So this Bureau of Corporations will be formed in 1903 under Teddy Roosevelt, and they're going to start investigating these major corporations. This is a cartoon of the time. This is Teddy taking on the Standard Oil Serpents. He actually doesn't initially take these on. He's going to take on, 45, it might be 54, I think it's 45 different monopolies while he's president. And what will happen, Bureau of Corporations investigates them. They determine their monopolies. Then again, they bring them to trial, force them to break up. He actually doesn't initially investigate Standard Oil. But John D. Rockefeller is worried that Teddy Roosevelt is going to start investigating Standard Oil. So in 1904, John D. Rockefeller, Teddy Roosevelt's going to run for re-election on the Republican Party ticket. Some Republicans don't want him on the ticket, but already he's becoming popular among the American people for things like the Bureau of Corporations. But he's running for re-election, and in 1904, John D. Rockefeller will write him a letter and include a $250,000 check. And what John D. Rockefeller is going to say is, "Hey, Mr. Roosevelt, I understand what's going on with you. I want us to remain friends, and as a gesture of this friendship, I'm going to give you this $250,000 check." And the letter's not going to directly state it, but it basically implies that he would like Teddy Roosevelt to stay away from Standard Oil. Don't get the Bureau of Corporations to look into my books. So Teddy's going to get this $250,000 check, and he gets this letter, and basically he's going to write back to John D. Rockefeller, and he says, Mr. Rockefeller, I appreciate the money, but this isn't going to prevent me from looking into your company. I'm not, open to bribes. Well, John D. Rockefeller, he doesn't believe that Teddy Roosevelt's not open to bribes. So he's going to go ahead and send the $250,000 check back and say, all right, fine, just do what you will. Kind of assuming that Teddy had to put on a show to show that, he wasn't being bribed. But second I send it back, this will work this time. Instead, what Teddy Roosevelt does is he's going to say, all right, you can tell a child something once, and if they but do it again, that's their fault. He basically cashes the $250,000 check. Then he immediately starts investigating Standard Oil. And from his beginning of his second administration to the end, the Bureau of Corporations will start collecting information on Standard Oil's monopolistic practices. Teddy, by the way, is going to win his a second term as president. And right at the end of the second term as president, the Bureau of Corporations will charge John D. Rockefeller with violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Rockefeller, he actually tries to avoid going to court, just flies all over, or drives all over the place to avoid the summons, but eventually they get him. And when he gets to court, the court will determine that Standard Oil had practiced interstate commerce, again crossing interstate lines, which makes them subject to the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they had used the beyond question the dominant position of the Standard Oil Company was due to unfair practice, to abuse of the control of pipelines, to railroad discriminations, and unfair methods of competition in the sale of refined oil, petroleum products. And the government is then going to force the various companies to work in competition with one another, and it's going to force this major stock sale off. So you guys violated Sherman Antitrust Act. This is the result. So when this happens, this is basically when we see Mobil, Pennzoil, Exxon, these companies break away. Now, John D. Rockefeller, you'd think he'd be broken up about this, but he's actually going to make money here. So this is a company being broken up not because they're doing poorly, but because of government intervention. So when his stocks are forced to sell off, a lot of people are going to end up buying them up for high prices in these new companies because it's sort of being forced to sell off, not because the company's not doing well. Again, the company actually is going to be doing really well because of this new automobile that's coming out, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is just one of many companies Teddy will break up. Again, I believe it's 44 or 45, maybe 54, I might be off a little bit, companies he will break up during his term as president. Again, nobody had charged anybody under the Sherman Antitrust Act prior to him becoming president. He does now. And as we're going to talk about later, some of the members of his party don't like this because, again, they like these big companies. They think they compete better on the world stage. So breaking up monopolies. Another thing that Teddy is going to do differently is he's going to start pushing for legislation to help farmers. So we had talked about it before. Farmers facing this problem of overproduction. They're producing too good at their job, flooding the markets with product, more supply than demand. You can't change that with some simple legislation, and Teddy won't. He's not going to know how, or he's not going to be able to pass through any legislation that will stop overproduction. But what Teddy will do is pass some minor legislation, and I should point out this is going to be done with bipartisan support because the Democrats, they don't like Teddy because he's a Republican, but they are going to work with him on a lot of things because he is doing some regulation of the economy, which the Democratic Party is on board with. So one of the bipartisan pieces of legislation Teddy will do is going to be something called the Hepburn Act, which he passes through in 1906. All the Hepburn Act says is that if you are a railroad company that operates across interstate lines, this makes you subject to that interstate commerce clause of the Constitution. So the Constitution, this goes way back to when the Constitution was first written. Basically, the federal government didn't want states passing duties against one another. So it said the national government can regulate interstate commerce. So if you do commerce over interstate lines, you're subject to federal regulation, or at least that's how they're going to interpret it under Teddy Roosevelt, and even previous presidents had interpreted it that way. So if you cross interstate lines, the federal government can regulate you. Most major railroad companies cross interstate lines. So what the Hepburn Act will say is that if you're one of these companies and the federal government receives complaints that you are price gouging, charging unfair prices to people using your railroad, the federal government can step in and force you to lower your prices. Now, again, some people want a complete government takeover of railroads. Teddy doesn't like that. He likes capitalism, but he doesn't like unregulated capitalism, taking advantage of the little guy. So this is sort of this compromise in between. You can we'll use this interstate commerce clause to force railroad companies to lower their prices so farmers don't get hurt. Now, this isn't going to completely solve the farmers' problem. Again, they still have overproduction issues. But the Hepburn Act is going to go through Congress, and this will dramatically decrease railroad rates, which is going to help farmers. This is a cartoon from the time, popular demand for railroad rate reform, and you have Congress being driven by Teddy Roosevelt, TR right there, Roosevelt program, and it's about to run over these railroad robber barons and fight against Roosevelt's policies. Here's another cartoon from the time, Roosevelt, wrestling this railroad company. This guy's sort of nightmare fuel here, man with a railroad head. Another thing here, been rolling a little too high. And again, it's Teddy Roosevelt telling these guys, hey, cut down. We got rebates, secret rates, that type of thing. Let's put a kibosh on all that. All right, so Teddy Roosevelt is now starting this dramatic reform. All right, another reform we're gonna see under Teddy Roosevelt is he's gonna start responding to these muckrakers, okay? And he's going to start addressing social issues that affect the American people. So basically, beginning in the late 1800s, we started seeing a new form of journalism. And again, I don't know if it's new, but I think it's going to be explored more than it had previously. What begins to happen in the late 1800s is certain journalists would try to find the problems plaguing regular society. Not the wealthy, but average Joe Schmo or the lower classes. They would find these issues and they would report on them. Now, this group of journalists are going to call them muckrakers because essentially they're not just looking even for average Joe Schmo, they're looking for the worst of the worst in society. So if we hear there's overcrowding in an area of New York, we're not going to find the apartment where 3 families are living. We're going to write a story about the apartment where 20 families are living and just people are crammed together. Things are absolutely awful. And we're going to bring this to the attention of the public. So basically, they go down in the muck and they rake it away to show what's underneath it to the American public. So they are exposing the plight of the lower classes, the problems of average everyday people, or I shouldn't say average everyday people, like sort of the worst off of American society, bringing this to public attention. Well, probably the most famous of the muckrakers and the person that's going to make muckraking a big part of journalism is this woman here, Nellie Bly. So Nellie Bly obviously is a woman, which is not, and she's going to be incredibly successful, which in the late 1800s is fairly exceptional. Late 1800s, early 1900s is going to be fairly exceptional because women outside of a certain fields, you don't see them in prominent positions. Women in 1800 societies were not expected to deal in politics. They were not expected to deal in business. And generally, women were seen as homemakers. If they did get into business, maybe they would work in a factory until they got married, but they're not expected to rise much above that. Women in general are regarded as they can be accepted in artistic fields. So you would see prominent women musicians, prominent women painters, prominent women writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you would see prominent women writers. That was accepted by the general American public. But generally, women weren't being taken seriously in journalism. So if you're talking about reporting on politics, well, that's not a women's field. If you're talking about economics, that's not a woman's field. And because of this, women are going to be generally relegated to puff pieces. So right on a cat walking across a piano, I'm just making that up as an example, but right on fashion, right on, things that aren't hard-hitting and might not be the most important social economic issues of the time. Well, Nellie Bly is going to be different, and she's going to use this assumption that this is how female journalists are supposed to operate to her advantage. What Nellie Bly will do is she's going to do things like set up interviews with people that are treating their workers poorly. And I'm just going to give you an example of something, this isn't a specific example. Let's say she had learned that at a particular garment factory, the owner is forcing their workers to work 14 hours a day, decreasing their pay, and 14, 16 hours a day, decreasing their pay, poor safety conditions, and things are just awful for workers in these factories. So what Nellie Bly would do is she would want to learn more about the conditions in this horrible factory. So she would write the owner of the factory and she would say, I'm Nellie Bly. I work for the New York Post or whatever newspaper. I think it was the New York Herald. Maybe she worked for. She worked for a couple different ones. But she would write the owner and she would say, I would like to talk to you about your factory. Well, the owner would see, this is a woman's handwriting. This is a woman writing this. She wants to learn about my new fashion line. So, sure, I'll meet with you, Miss Bly. Nellie Bly then goes and meets him for an interview. Yes, little lady, what can I help you with? Do you want to see the new dresses we're coming out with next year? Yes, sir, I would like to know why you're treating your workers horribly. Why do you make them work 16 hours a day? Why does that man's finger off? And she would start asking these hard-hitting questions, and a lot of times it would catch these guys off guard. So she would use the assumptions about women to her advantage to sort of get these factory owners and these people she's investigating off balance, I guess is what you could say. So she was sort of the best of the best muckrakers. As a matter of fact, most prominent her most prominent expose is going to occur in 1887. So shortly before this time when muckraking starts to get really big. What Nellie Bly learns is she learns that this facility for the insane, I believe is what they called it at the time, this place, this mental institution, she learns that this place where women are being treated for insanity in New York has horrible living conditions. She just hears rumors about it. She hears awful things coming out of it. But when when her coworkers try to investigate it, nobody's allowed inside. They're basically, people are receiving treatment here. You can't investigate it. So what Nellie Bly decides to do is she's going to tell a coworker, I'm going to get myself committed to learn about this mental institution from the inside. So she goes to a hotel, starts acting crazy, knowing that the owner of the hotel is going to call the mental institution, have her brought in. So she's brought into this mental institution right outside of New York, and she's going to be thrown in with these other women that are supposedly insane. Well, Nellie Bly gets in and she learns that things are awful. She sees women thrown into these cells where there's not proper bathroom. There'll just be a bucket. They're being fed food with maggots in it. There's rats everywhere. There are reports that the guards are sexually abusing women. And things are just absolutely awful in this mental institution. Maybe even worse of all, she discovers that some of the women in the facility aren't insane. They're being kept there, and they were put in there because their husbands had basically gotten tired of them, had said that they're hysterical, and they get thrown in this institution where they can't prove they're sane because they're going to be fed a variety of different drugs to where they just don't have the mental faculties to properly prove their sanity, and again they can't get out because of that. So she learns about awful conditions: food with maggots, rats, sexual abuse, women who are sane thrown in here just because people are getting tired of them. All these terrible things. Well, after a period of time, Nellie Bly's coworker will come and take her out of the mental institution, and she's going to write this huge expose on this mental health in New York. And this is going to lead to dramatic political reform. Basically, the city and state of New York will start this reformation of their mental health institutions based on her expose. So I'm bringing this up because this is going to start a trend. You see muckrakers bring up social issues, people get angry about them, and then politicians react to the people's anger. This is going to happen under Teddy Roosevelt. Specifically, it's going to come under Teddy Roosevelt, not because of an expose by Nellie Bly. She goes on to do a number of other interesting things. She goes around the world in 80 days. I think she actually does it in like 72. And she writes a number of other exposés. But the one that's really going to affect Teddy Roosevelt is going to be this muckraking done by this guy, Upton Sinclair, and turned into a book called The Jungle, okay? All right, so before I start this, the jungle isn't going to be like Nellie Bly's reporting. The jungle is going to be a work of fiction. And if you were to ask somebody, or maybe whatever the jungle is about, the vast majority of people are going to say, well, it's about the meatpacking industry. That's not what it was intended to be about. Upton Sinclair is not intending to write a meatpacking book. He basically is a socialist. He is one of these guys that thinks that conditions are so bad for workers, you need the government to step in, nationalize industry, and then use the products of the industry. The profits should go to the workers, not this capitalist big cat. And so Upton Sinclair believes in socialism, and in particular, he's worried about immigrant workers coming to the United States. He sees people like Leon Solgos' parents come over, from Poland or whatever, working for such low wages, living in an apartment with a bunch of other factories, and being treated incredibly poorly. And he basically says, I want to write about the plight of immigrants, and I want to promote socialism. How can I do this? What would be a good way to write this story? Well, Upton Sinclair is going to learn that, hear rumors that things are really gross in meat packing facilities. So a lot of these immigrant workers, when they come in, they work at meat packing plants like Armour, Swift. A lot of these meat packing companies are still around today. Green Bay Packers named after meat packing companies. But he hears that things are awful in these companies, and he's going to decide if this is true. This would be a perfect setting for my novel about immigrant workers and in my promotion of socialism. So what Upton Sinclair is going to decide to do is to work at a meatpacking facility for a period of time so he can learn about the setting of his new book. So he goes to work at this meatpacking facility. What meatpacking facilities are supposed to look like in the early 1900s is this. No matter what you do, these things are going to be gross, but in a perfect world, you'd have things lined up, everything sort of clean, meat getting cut up properly, animals being executed properly, that type of thing, and it'd be sort of this clean process. This isn't what Upton Sinclair is going to find. What he finds is that at these meatpacking facilities, there's just blood everywhere. Blood, urine. He's going to find that the animals, after being chopped up, they'll just let organs lay around the ground. He's going to find that some of the workers would lose fingers and stuff during the cutting process. He would find that some of the meat will be left on the floor, left around, not properly packed. It's going to start getting maggots on it. They're going to start having mold, things like that on the animals as they go down. And he's going to see rats being ground up in the meat. And again, a lot of this meat is stuff that's being put in canned to be shipped to places in the East. So this is where the meat goes. It's put into cans. They don't have proper refrigeration, or at least most Americans don't at this time. So they open the can. This is where you get their meat. Well, Upton Sinclair learns that some of this meat is maggot infested. A lot of it is rat meat. It's not the stuff it should be. Well, when he writes The Jungle, he's going to put these details in it. Initially, The Jungle, it's actually going to be published as a series of essays in Socialist magazine. Later on, these essays will be compiled into the book, The Jungle. So initially in a Socialist magazine, but later compiled into this book. Well, when people read Sinclair's novel, and basically he ends The Jungle, I should point this out, by talking about the immigrant workers, how they should unite, and calls for socialism. So again, he's trying to use this as a message to promote socialism. Well, people are going to read The Jungle, and they're not going to read what he wants them to read. They're going to read this, and they're going to say, are you effing kidding me? Is this really happening to my meat? They don't care about the socialism. They don't care about the immigrants. They just care that this meat is disgusting. And the people will ask Upton Sinclair, is this really what you saw? And he says, absolutely, that part's true. But hey, did you get the part where we should be socialists and immigrants? No, we don't care about that. We care about our meat. So Upton Sinclair will start this call for investigation of meatpacking facilities. And word of the jungle is going to reach up to Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he's heard about the jungle. He thinks Upton Sinclair's making stuff up. He thinks it's socialist. He doesn't like socialism. He likes responsible capitalism. He hears about this, and he's going to sort of dismiss it. This guy is just a rabble rouser. What he's saying is all made up. So Teddy Roosevelt will dismiss this, the jungle initially, but there's going to be such a call, to investigate it that Teddy Roosevelt's going to decide, fine, I'm going to put together a commission and I'm going to send them to a handful of these meatpacking facilities to see what Upton Sinclair, see if what Upton Sinclair is saying is true. Well, Teddy Roosevelt puts together some guys he trusts, and he even is going to tell the meatpacking companies, hey, I got some guys there. We're going to go investigate the silly socialists. I'm sure you guys are running things fine, but just in case, I'll be there in a couple days, and when we get there, my guys are going to investigate things. Again, I'm sure this guy's making things up. Well, when Roosevelt's investigators reach these factories, even given warning, the factories are just as gross as Sinclair says them. The only thing so Sinclair wrote in The Jungle that humans got ground up into meat. That didn't happen. That was just an analogy used. But everything else, the rats, the rotten meat, the maggots everywhere, the urine, that stuff is true. And his guys are going to report back to Teddy, this stuff is gross. Upton Sinclair is telling the truth. So after learning this, Teddy will push Congress to pass a series of legislation to deal with this issue. First thing is going to be something called the Meat Inspection Act. So 1906, based on what they learned, there's going to be this Meat Inspection Act. Again, using the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, it will say that the federal government can investigate meatpacking facilities that ship across interstate lines and periodically investigate to determine if things are clean. If they're not, the federal government could shut them down, force regulations, that type of thing. So that's passed in 1906 as a result of the outcry in Teddy Roosevelt's investigation based on the jungle. Not only that, there's also going to be in 1906 something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. This is going to create the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. What the Food and Drug Act will do is it's going to create a body that is going to test food and drugs to make sure that it's made of what the company said it's made of and that it does what the company says it does. Now, Food and Drug Administration operates in a variety of different ways, but what basically is supposed to do is if somebody says this is a can of ham, we test it to make sure it's ham. We don't find rat meat in there. We're not made a guinea pig or something like that. If it is, then there's going to be some issues. And also another major issue of the time is you would have these snake oil salesmen, is what they would call them at the time, saying that their treatment cured cancer or whatever. And the Food and Drug Administration is going to investigate and determine, is this claim true or not? If it's not, you don't get FDA approval and you can't go to the market. So this might not sound like a big deal to us today. We're used to the federal government making sure our food's not gross. But then you look at it, that's ridiculous to a lot of Americans. Laissez-faire Democrats, a handful of those guys are still around. The government's not supposed to do this. Pro-business Republicans, a lot of these guys are going to be like looking at the member of their own party saying, hey, this is going to hurt big business in the long run. But Teddy, we had a problem. This is a solution to it, and the solution is big government. So, again, directly responding to social issues. Not just going to be FDA, Meat Inspection Act. Under under Teddy, the FBI will be created, Federal Bureau of Investigations. Teddy's a little wary about creating this, but there have been things like multi-state prostitution rings, where you would have organized crime shipping prostitutes over interstate lines, and you would have these gambling rings, things like that. Well, local police could not investigate these things properly, so they're going to create this FBI to investigate these interstate crimes. And again, it's another social issue, social problem that you're going to address with the government. So again, another very big departure from the way things had been done. All right, so very different in a lot of ways. Well, in another way, Teddy will depart from previous presidents, and this is going to be in regards to federal lands. When Teddy takes over as, or Teddy, a little bit about his background, we talked about this a minute ago, but Teddy loved the outdoors. He, as a young kid, his father would take him out on these hikes, horseback riding, and he would, have the best time in his life out in the backwoods of New York. Again, went out to the Dakotas, spent some time out there after his first wife died. And basically, he thought the outdoors was responsible for developing his character, and he wanted future generations to have the same experiences he had outdoors. Well, when he takes over as president, it looks like this might not be a reality, because what's happening in the West is that a lot of land, this land that hadn't been claimed by the Homestead Act, some actually that had been claimed by the Homestead Act, was being bought up by lumber companies, mining companies. And what these lumber companies would do is they would go in, completely clear out an entire forest, take the money, that they get from the lumber, and when they leave, they sort of abandon the land, and this forest is gone. So that forest that might have given a kid an experience like Teddy Roosevelt had ceases to exist. Same thing with mining companies. What they would do is they would just go into these mountains and find it cheaper than, instead of digging shafts, just clear off the top of the mountain, get to the ore that way. And again, at the end of this thing, the mining company leaves, but the mountain's essentially gone. Teddy Roosevelt hates that because he wants future generations to have the experiences he did, but it makes it impossible. Well, Teddy is going to determine that he wants to save these possibility of these experiences for future generations. So what he's going to do is start conserving as much land as possible. He's going to be a major conservationist. So he wants to preserve this land as much as possible. We don't generally call him an environmentalist, even though he's going to be trying to save the environment, because one of the reasons Teddy wants to conserve this land for future generations is that Teddy really liked to hunt. He liked to kill the crap out of animals, and he wants to make sure that future generations have the ability to kill the crap out of animals too. So, because of this, some environmentalists don't know if they want to share this label with him, but he definitely is a conservation. He wants to conserve the forest and the animals for future generations to explore the woods and kill the animals like he was able to. So what we're going to see Teddy Roosevelt do when he becomes president is he's going to start taking advantage of this provision that had been put in place during Reconstruction. So as we talked about, during Reconstruction, Republicans controlled the presidency, they controlled both houses of Congress, Supreme Court, and during Grant's administration, President Grant's administration, he noticed that there were certain places where battles had been fought in the Civil War, they were being exploited for commercial purposes. So there are battles like, I don't know if this is one exactly, battles like Gettysburg, where thousands of Americans died. Since the time of the battle, people had bought up the land, and they were building stores on top of it. They were grazing cattle, and they were basically using land where Americans had died for commercial purposes. Well, Ulysses S. Grant didn't like that. He wanted to conserve this land. So what Grant is going to ask Congress to do is to give him permission to take land and put it under federal protection. So generally this is land that's unclaimed, that's not owned by anybody, but if it's federal government land, we're not going to give it away for Homestead Act. We're not going to sell it off to anybody. We're going to put it on reserve to where it will never be sold, and it will be there exactly the same for future generations. So he wants to reserve these battle sites. Well, Congress, hey, you're Republican, we control both houses of Congress. They'll give Grant this permission, and during Grant's administration, we'll see a number of battlefields will be conserved by Grant. Not a whole heck of a lot, though. It's just basically battlefields. And subsequent presidents will also reserve land. Some are going to do it for pretty land, but most of it's going to be battlefields, things like that. And as a matter of fact, from Grant to Teddy, so every president from Grant to Teddy will reserve about 45 million acres of federal land. So if it's federal government owned, we're saying this can never be sold, never be claimed as Homestead Act. It's there for future generations to take advantage of. Well, when Teddy gets in office, that provision is still on there that says the president can reserve land without permission from Congress, still on the books. Well, Teddy's going to say, all right, if this is on the books, I want to conserve this land. I don't want to be sold off to lumber and mining companies. So he's going to put 150 million acres in reserve during his first and into his second term as president, 3 times as much as all previous presidents had combined. Basically, any land that he's heard that's pretty, we're not going to do anything here. This is going to be federal land. We're not selling it to anybody. Nobody can come in here and mine or lumber. The federal government owns it, and it's going to stay protected. All right. So he starts reserving this land, keeping it under federal ownership. Well, this isn't going to make some members of his party happy. Again, the Republican Party, Teddy's dragging a lot of them to his progressive reforms. Parties like to win. And, a lot of people in the Republican Party have been pro-business, but they see Teddy moving them in this direction, and they're going to become reform-minded Republicans as well. Some are going to say, okay, maybe I was reform-minded before, but sort of fell in this pro-business loop. Teddy's going to drag these guys, and he's going to have this pro-business branch, this reform branch of the Republican Party, and he's going to have a lot of bipartisan support from reform-minded Democrats, and we're going to have these progressives that see what Teddy's doing and enjoy it. But there's some members of the Republican Party that don't like this. These pro-business Republicans say, you're hurting lumber companies, you're hurting mining companies. This is less land that can be exploited to mine for minerals. This is going to, we're not going to get lumber as cheap. This is going to end up hurting American business. So they see what Teddy's doing. They don't like it. So in 1907, Congress is going to pass a bill meant to give money to the Forestry Service. So very briefly, what the Forestry Service was a branch that, Teddy's actually going to make it a part of his cabinet. And what the Forestry Service did was make sure that federal lands that have been put under reserve are not being exploited. So there's a ton of land out there that the federal government owns. You got to make sure to send people out there and investigate it, or else, somebody could go in, chop the trees down, and then, take off without the federal government knowing. So the Forestry Service basically oversees federally owned land, part of the Department of the Interior. So the Forestry Service protects this land. So when this, in 1907, a funding bill for the Forestry Service is making its way through Congress, and Teddy's planning to sign it because, again, he wants funding for protecting these forests. Well, the pro-business Republicans, as it's going through Congress, are going to attach a rider to the bill. So what a rider is it's basically like an amendment to the bill. It adds something on there that might be very different than what the bill is for. So let's say, somebody wants to pass, or is pushing through a bill that, is meant to give education to, veterans or something like that. That's something that probably both parties would support. But what somebody might do is they might stick something on this education for veterans bill that might not be popular because they want Congress to pass it. And so they might stick on a kill kittens bill, So Congress, I want to pass this thing. I've got to pass it or else I'll be looked at as a guy that doesn't support veteran education. But, whatever, I'll go ahead and pass it, even though it's got a bill on there, a rider on there that says we're also going to kill a bunch of kittens. So that's kind of a tactic that you'll see in Congress. You find a popular bill, a bill that's probably going to pass, and you stick something on there that will might not be popular to get it passed. Well, as this funding for the Forestry Service is going through Congress in 1907, pro-business Republicans stick on a rider that says, if this bill is put into law, then no longer can the president reserve land without approval of Congress. So it's going to get rid of that power that was given to Grant during the Reconstruction, and no longer can Teddy reserve land willy-nilly like he had been prior to 1907. Well, the bill is going to arrive on Teddy's desk in 1907. He wants to sign it. He needs to sign it because the Forestry Service needs funding, or all the federal protection of land he's done is just going to go kaput because there's not going to be anybody there to monitor it. But he doesn't like this rider taking away his power to reserve land. So what Teddy's going to decide to do is that presidents have 10 days to sign a bill. If they don't sign it or veto it in that 10 days, it goes into law. So what Teddy's going to do is take that 10 days and use it to reserve almost 20 million additional acres of land. Basically, he calls up anybody he knows that's a conservationist and says, do you have any land that's kind of pretty? All right, send me a map of it. Hey, Steve over here, do you have land that's kind of pretty? Send me a map of it. John, send me a map of it. We're going to reserve as much as possible. So he uses his power, stays up all night, multiple days, and he reserves as much land as he can before the bill goes into effect, and he loses that power. So again, this shows his level of conservation, but it also shows the opposition he's facing from within his own party. All right, so that's one thing we're going to see with Teddy Roosevelt is this conservation of land. Well, by 1908, Teddy is incredibly popular. Again, some people in his own party don't like him. You have some old school Democrats that don't want to support him because he's a Republican, but an extremely popular candidate. Some people are going to suggest to Teddy, why don't you run for a third term? There's no constitutional amendment at this point saying that presidents can't run for a third term. So, there's going to be this big push, and especially along with the fact that Teddy didn't serve all of the first term, part of it was taken by McKinley. But Teddy's ultimately going to say, no, I had my time. I'm only going to serve 2 terms. I served almost all of the first term, and I served all of the second term. I'm done. I have other things I'm going to do. By this point, Teddy's pretty young. I think he's mid-40s, late 40s, something like that. And he's going to say, I want to go explore the world. I want to go enjoy my life. I'm going to sort of step back from politics. 2 terms is enough for me. So Teddy's going to decide to not run for this third term. But in not running for the third term, he wants to make sure he's handing the presidency off to somebody he trusts, somebody that he thinks is going to continue the reforms that he'd started making. The person he's going to pick is this guy here, William Howard Taft. We talked about Taft briefly before. He'd been governor of the Philippines. He's partly responsible for ending the insurgency in the Philippines, and capturing Aguinaldo, this dollar diplomacy thing. Teddy had made him, because of his success, his Secretary of War, and Taft had served very well as Secretary of War, and Teddy had taken to Taft. Now, Taft, I think the reason that Teddy liked him is because Taft wasn't outspoken like Teddy. So Teddy would get into a room and he loved talking. So he would, hey, this is my idea. Bully. He would talk like this. Bully, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Bill, what do you think about this? And he would point to Taft. And what Teddy really liked is that Bill would just, William Howard Taft would say, yeah, thumbs up. And we're like, yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Taft basically was probably too intimidated by Teddy to say anything back. So he would just sort of nod his head whenever Teddy said anything. And so Teddy would be like, well, bully, Bill gets it. And he sort of, Taft's silence confirmed everything that Teddy thought. And he was very happy with Taft. And so in 1908, when he's looking for a successor, he sees Taft and says, well, this guy gets it. Why don't you take over for me as president? And so he is going to make Taft his chosen successor. And Taft, on paper, is going to seem like, yes, I'm going to continue to do what Teddy does, trust busting, all that type of thing. And Teddy's very happy with this. I've got the guy who I can entrust with the presidency. And throughout 1908, Teddy's going to endorse Taft. Taft will win the Republican Party nomination because of Teddy. And he's essentially going to ride Teddy into the White House. So this is a cartoon from the time. It's basically portraying Taft here as Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy's pet. Teddy sort of dragging him along with his policies. This is my chosen guy to continue this reform. So 1904, or I'm sorry, 1908, Teddy chooses Taft. They're going to run against William Jennings Bryan. He runs again. He's running again also on reform, which is a thing, but he's running primarily on economic reform. Teddy's running on his economic reform and social reform. And poor William Jennings Bryan, he's not going to have a chance to win this election because people love Teddy. So basically, hurry, Bill, we're in the stretch. You know, Ted, I'm all in. If Taft is elected, wonder if Roosevelt will still be president. That's the general perception, is that if you elect Taft, you're essentially electing Teddy to an additional term. And poor William Jennings Bryan, he's going to lose this fairly handedly. The Republicans are going to almost win by 10% of the vote. Is going to go to Taft. That's a pretty substantial margin, almost 10%. You rarely see that. And the Democrats really only win in their stronghold in the South. I mean, they get a couple other states here where William Jennings Bryan's populist roots are really strong, but they only win the South. Taft's going to take the presidency fairly easily. Well, Teddy, after this, is going to decide to, Bill, you've got it. I'm going to go on this world tour. You can handle things while I'm gone. And what we're going to talk about next time is how Taft is going to handle the presidency.